Tonight's topic is 8 days of Thanksgiving, and I wish everyone again Chanuka Sameach. I want to try to understand a little bit about the Tefila of HaNisim. Some of its placement, obviously it's in Tefila, we know. It's in Birkat Hamazon, we know. What's the significance of it? We know what the words say. You can read an English translation. You don't need me for that. But what are its roots and what's its halachic stature? I'm going to put some sources on the screen, and I want us to try together maybe to learn through them. Normally in a Shiur setting, of course, this is the part where I hand out packets and hope that everyone can follow along. It's much easier on the screen. You could just put it up in front of everybody and scroll through it as we go. Okay, so this Shiur in a certain way, you could say, is part 2 of a Shiur from Thanksgiving Day, which was actually about Birkat Hamazon. And I was thinking more and more about Birkat Hamazon and its significance, and particularly as regards Chanuka. All 8 days, of course, we say HaNisim, not only in Tefila 3 times a day, but also when we sit at the table. As we'll soon see, there's actually important halachic distinctions between the two. Firstly, a little bit about the history. The Gemara itself, right at the very beginning, the first sugya dealing with the history of Chanuka, on Masachet Shabbat Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Bet, my Chanuka. The Gemara queries, what is Chanuka? What's it about? The Tana Rabbanan, our sages taught, B'Chafei B'Kislev Yomei de Chanuka Timnaya Inun. There are 8 days of Chanuka. Misped Bahon, not to give hespedim eulogies, Litanot Bahon, not to fast on these days. Shekenish Nichnesu Yevanim Lahechal Timu Kol Ashmanim Shebehechal. When the Greeks broke into the sanctuary, they defiled all of the oil that was in the sanctuary. When the Hasmonean dynasty got rolling, so v'natzchum, and they were victorious over them. Badku v'lo matzu elapach echad shel shemen shehaya munach b'chotam shel kohen gadol. They found one cruse of oil, as we know the story. That's the story the Gemara tells, and it was sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol. V'lo hayabo el lahadlik yom echad. It was enough to last 1 day. Nasib ones, there was a miracle. They got 8 days out of it. Why did it have to be 8 days? That's a separate question. The easiest answer is they needed that amount of time to get more kosher oil. Let's put it that way. In other words, more pure oil, I should say. It took that amount of time to bring it. There are a lot of different answers to this question about what's the nature of the nes and why is it 8 days, not 7 days, not our topic for tonight. But I want you to see that the history, as is told here in the Gemara about what is Chanuka, is very little about the war, almost nothing about a war. It's one word, v'natzchum. You could say Gavra Malchut Beit Chashmonai, when the Hasmoneans, the house of the Hasmoneans, became strong. It was going to be victorious. So they vanquished the dragon, if you will. They checked, they didn't find the Pach, and this is the nes. The nes is that they found the Pach Shemen. And it lasted 8 days. L'shana acheret, another year, or a later year. Kav'um va'asum yamim tovim b'hala v'hoda. Afterwards, some later point, some say it was literally the next year, some say it was maybe even a little while later. They established, fixed, and set it as days that are good, yamim tovim, b'halel v'hoda. Halal v'hoda means just that. Halel is like we say halal. Hoda means thanksgiving. Now, I gave you one Rashi here, right at the top on the inset on the left-hand side. Let's look at it inside. V'asum yamim tovim b'hala v'hoda, says Rashi. Lo she'asurin b'malacha. Don't think when it says Yom Tov, it means you have to light candles at the beginning and you can't do any malacha throughout the day. No, not asur. Shelo nikbu ela likrot halel v'lomar al HaNisim b'hoda. These days were established to read Hallel and to say HaNisim in Hoda'ah. What's Hoda'ah? We'll soon see. Literally in English, it means Thanksgiving, the blessing of Thanksgiving. But we'll have to see a little more in depth in a moment. So just looking at this, and I'm sorry, I think I shut down the ability for people to unmute themselves. So I'm going to undo that because otherwise it's not participatory at all. So forgive me, that was accidental. Okay, so if anyone wants to unmute themselves and speak, here's my question. When you read this, it's a story that is principally about the miracle of the oil. You know HaNisim probably pretty well from previous years. Where does it mention the Nes Pach Shem and the miracle of the oil in HaNisim? Feel free to hazard a guess. Okay, it's a trick question. If you look through HaNisim, it mentions the Nes Pach Shemen exactly 0 times. You would think, given the reality of how this is described in the Gemara, it would stand to reason that the next step would be, and here's the prayer that tells the story of what's in the Gemara in another version. But no. Instead, we open HaNisim, and we find that it's telling us what seems like some kind of other story, an exclusive story about one thing, the war. Or almost exclusive, I should say it should be that categorical. What I want to show you is tonight a little bit about why that's the case, but also to try to understand the place of HaNisim in our Tefila when we're seated at the table in the midst of Birkat Hamazon. That's sort of where I'm going, why I feel this is an important subject. And it's germane, obviously, for tonight and any of the days of the holiday. We have the bracha of Hoda'ah. Chazal call the bracha that we call Modim very often is the bracha of Hoda'ah in the Amida. The Amida was written, of course, by the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, the men of the Great Assembly. Chazal tell us there were 120 of them. The Gemara in Megillah says, Unavim beinehem, there were prophets among them. They were principally Chachamim, but they're really at the bridge between the world of Nevuah, of prophecy, and the world of Chachamim, which would later spawn the world of the Mishnah and the Gemara, etc. The last of the Anshe Knesset Hagdola happens to be Shimon HaTzadik. You probably know the name very well from Pirkei Avot. And Shimon HaTzadik Hayam Mishyare Anshe Knesset Hagdola. The second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot tells us that the last of them was named Shimon HaTzadik. And we know that Shimon HaTzadik was the person, in his person, individually, had a meeting with, an encounter with Alexander Mokdon, Alexander of Macedon. He met Alexander of Macedon. Alexander of Macedon came to Eretz Yisrael. So they had an encounter. And then after that, that's already not Anshe Knesset Hagdola. Why do I give you a little history lesson? What you have in the right-hand column was written by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. What's in the left-hand column is not written by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. It's after their time, but it's still written, patterned after the themes that are in the bracha of Modim. I gave you some highlights here. I hope it doesn't make anybody dizzy to look at all the different colors, but I want to show you some examples. For instance, the very fact that it uses the expression here upon the miracles that are with us each and every day, the syntax becomes HaNisim. As it's each and every day, so too, the idea that we're fixing it in time and in a certain way, this story of Chanuka is built out of as it's an example, it's a demonstration of the miracles that are with us each and every day. This idea here, according to some of the versions of the Sefer that we have of a siddur, we know that it's a composite, and there are many different nuschaot. Some versions of the siddur actually have a break in the siddur right after this word. And what do they have? HaNisim. And then after that, they finish, and upon your wonders and upon your goodness that is at all times, sandwiched in. What are an example of the miracles? Here's an example. The Chachamim who wrote HaNisim, and of course its provenance is quite old, but it's not as old as Anshe Knesset Hagdola, understood that they had to show people this is a demonstration of what we're talking about in the bracha of Modim. You have here also the notion of Rachamim, V'tabarachamecha harabim, right? Your mercies have not ceased, and therefore, and you in your great mercy. And here's the example. The story that is inside this narration of HaNisim is actually just the story about the war. It doesn't seem to mention almost anything about the Nes Pach Shemen. The best we get is that they lit candles, but it doesn't say anything miraculous about the candles. We'll have to come back to that. I wanted to also make mention, of course, the word Shu'ah and Magen Yish'enu. You don't have these words all falling into place in other brachot. It makes sense that it should fit in here as such. It's proof positive. The language is borrowed, yeah? When we say Modim in Shul, it's not the same as when we say Modim as individuals in our Amida. It's called the Modim D'Rabbanan, when the Shliach Tzibor says, They're modim out loud, the regular modim. So we all recite modim d'Rabbanan in an undertone. There was a competition, not for now, between different chachamim. What should modim look like? So the compromise, if you will, ends up being we end up saying both. In the modim d'Rabbanan, which is only recited in a communal context nowadays, it's that which is recited in the context of tzibur. We have here the idea that we are going to give blessings and thanksgivings l'shimcha hagadol v'hakadosh, to your name, which is great and which is holy. The exact example of this in history, that is the first example brought about in the Amida, ulecha asita shem gadol v'kadosh be'olamecha. You made for yourself a name that is great and that is holy in your world. Now, once we see, and Modim D'Rabbanan also includes that we hope and pray someday you will gather all of the exiles into the courtyards of your sanctuary. What do we describe in HaNisim? It came true. They lit the candles in the Chatzot Kodshecha. From being Galuyotenu, a class of people who are exiles, we become Vachakein Ba'u Vanecha. The sense of connection to Hashem in a parent-child relationship is palpable. And of course, the signature line, which is unique because it actually includes within the tefillah that is meant to be describing a narration, a story, the endpoint is, oh, and by the way, they enacted a special holiday whose function is lahodot ulahalel. We just saw these two words in the Gemara. They're reversed here for various reasons, but the point of having them here is because that's what Shas had said. We go back up to the Gemara used the expression, exactly these words, that these kavaum, vasaum, yamim, tovim, behalel, behoda. Rashi said, oh, that's HaNisim. And that's why the end of it ends with lahodot ulahalel. Again, a reference to God's great name, l'shimcha gadol. We have here l'shimcha gadol. We don't have this in too many other places in the Amida. It makes sense that it's here. Okay, now, in this, the summation, of course, is also all of that which lives. It should all give thanks to you. That's yoducha milashon todah. Same idea as hoda'ah, modim, nodelecha, etc. The hallelu, there's the hallel. There's hoda'ah and hallel. We say these words, the Amida, every single day. Often we don't realize every day we're talking about hoda'ah and hallel. Again, this idea that Hashem saves us, is involved with us, engaged with us, and the like. Okay. So far, what have we seen? We looked at a little bit of the basic history in the Gemara, which is well known to all of us. But as I like to say, oftentimes when we learn, we're looking for the piece that's missing. The theme that we're expecting is going to be in there that's almost not mentioned. And the part that is mentioned, i.e. the Nes Pach Shemen, is then ignored in the actual tefillah that's supposed to be about it, based on what the Gemara said, based on what Rashi said. So it's curious where it's hiding, what happened to it, where did it go, why didn't it appear as such? Now, all of this, in a certain way, is just the groundwork that lays the foundation for the following discussion in the Gemara. Next slide, if you will. The Gemara further along on page 24, we were on 21b, now on 24, same parak, asks the question as follows. Should we mention Chanuka in Birkat HaMazon? Now, we would take this as a very obvious question. The answer is yes, because that's what we do. But this was actually a question in Shas. What should we do? Ibayelahu, ma'u lehazkir shel Chanukah b'Birkat HaMazon. Rashi, b'Birkat HaMazon, b'Tefila pshita lan. It's obvious that in davening we're going to say it. Shaharei lahalel ulehoda nikbeu kedamrin le'el. As we said before, it's for the purpose of halal and hoda. So halal is recitation of halal, and hoda means in the bracha of hoda, give thanks. How? Say it in your Amida. But there's a real question here about what about saying it in Birkat HaMazon? Why? Kevan d'midrabanan hu lomad kirinan. Maybe you could say the fact is that it is merely, in quotation marks, a rabbinic holiday, i.e., it does not have the stature of being on a biblical level. It's not a biblical holiday, it's rabbinic in nature, and therefore it doesn't really warrant putting something into Birkat HaMazon. Last we studied Birkat HaMazon, I'll remind you, we saw that the brachot of Birkat HaMazon have an even older provenance than the Amida. Whereas the Amida is written by the Anshe Knesset HaGedola, according to our tradition, the Birkat HaMazon, first bracha, ascribed to Moshe Rabbeinu. Second bracha, Yoshua bin Nun. Third bracha, David and Shlomo. Yes, we did see that later generations made modifications, certainly to that third bracha. David and Shlomo didn't sing to Hashem, Uvenei Yerushalayim, build Yerushalayim. It was built. So that is a change. Rachem na Hashem Elokeinu, etc. And to build it. Now Tatzrichenu, we don't want to have to be worried about living hand to mouth from other people. We want just from you, Hashem, etc. Re'enu, Zunenu, be our shepherd and feed us, etc. All of that. Okay, those are modifications, but the core is biblical in nature. So we should go ahead and add in that there was there was a Chanuka. Great, we said it in davening. It made sense. We're thanking Hashem, so it goes there. There is a bracha though of Hoda in Birkat Hamazon. Remember, no delecha Hashem. Look at the second bracha, which we saw last time, is in a certain way the core bracha. It's the one that quotes the verse from the Torah. V'achalta v'savata u'virachta et Hashem Elokecha al haaretz hatuva asher natan lach baruch atah Hashem al haaretz ve'al hamazon. The aretz and the mazon were intertwined. So the bracha of Hoda, we said in benching, is a second bracha from Noda till haaretz ve'al hamazon. That blessing is in a certain way the foundational one, of which the other two are like a sandwich around it, but it's the core, it's in the center. But the Gemara here is actually asking this. Oh, Dilmer, maybe you could say, back to the Gemara, Mishum Pirsum Nisa Medachrina. Maybe because there's Pirsum Hanes, we're announcing that there was a miracle. Maybe we should mention it. Maybe the name, the words about Chanuka do obtain in this instance. So this is a discussion. And indeed, Amar Rava, Amar Rav Schora, Amar Rav Huna, Eino Mazkir. You just should mention it. The imbala hazkir, if you do come to mention it, if you decide you're going to, so mazkir behoda, then it does belong in the bracha of hoda. Rav Huna bar Yehuda ikla lebei Rava, savarlad kure bebonei Yerushalayim. I guess it was Chanuka, and Rav Huna bar Yehuda went to the house of Rava, and he wanted to mention HaNisim, our HaNisim, in which bracha? In bonei Yerushalayim. It should go in that bracha. Amar lahu Rav Sheshet kitfila. No, it should be just like in prayer. Matfila behoda, af birkat hamazon behoda. Just as in prayer we say it in the bracha of thanksgiving, so too in birkat hamazon it should go in the bracha of thanksgiving, not in the bracha of Yerushalayim. Let me ask you a question. If you're Rav Huna bar Yehuda and you went to the Rebbe's house, to Rava's house, granted you don't have the temerity to just kind of make things up, but obviously he was a great chacham. What's his logic? Why should HaNisim possibly go into the bracha about Yerushalayim as opposed to the bracha of Hoda, of Thanksgiving? What would the logic be? Just from a logical perspective, right? Should be fairly obvious. Chanuka happens in Yerushalayim. Min hastam, that's pretty obvious. But what's the holiday about? Is it actually mostly about a Hoda to Hashem, that we actually had this happen? Or if you put it in the bracha of Boni Yerushalayim, presumably there's a bit of a theme of, we're not all the way there yet. Historically, unfortunately, the Hasmonean dynasty went to rage and ruin in the intervening years after the great festivities of Chanuka. Things were going down. That would be an understatement. Nonetheless, the Rambam writes there's 200 years of some kind of independence, and that's worthy of celebration. It's that middle bracha of Hoda in Birkat Hamazon is very much about the celebration of, or rather thanksgiving about the Eretz, about the land of Israel, about something covenantal that's going on, about Brit Chashchatamte V'Sarein, about Torah Chashim Alatanu, the Brit of Brit Milah, and the Brit of Brit Torah. These are covenants that we have with Hashem from the days of the patriarchs through Har Sinai and until today. If you put in the bracha of Yerushalayim, you can make a case, but the language also fits much more with the bracha of Noda Lecha. If you just think about how it plays, it fits more with the bracha. We should think of Hoda, of thanksgiving. That the fact that in davening it's in Hoda. So Rava told him, no, you're incorrect. It really does belong in the bracha of Hoda. Look with me at Tosfot here. Tosfot asks as follows. They quote Rashi, "B'tfila pshitale, the mazkir mishum the tefila b'tziburhu, the ika presume nisa." They're really, everyone would agree, you're publicizing the miracle if you're davening in shul. You're saying HaNisim. Maybe the shliach tzibur decides he's going to sing it, right? So aval b'berkat hamazon sheba bayit leke presume nisa kulei. Bali Tosfot say, the question of the Gemara here, why it is a question in benching, You're just your family by yourself, and maybe it's not that great of a Pirsumei Nisa. Mazkir behoda, maybe you put it in hoda. HaNisim hoda'i v'lo tefila. It is, after all, not a prayer that's petitional. It's rather a prayer that is a prayer of thanksgiving. By rights, it belongs there, and that's actually, of course, the halacha. But the Bali Tosfa give us some window into what the rationale might be about why it should appear possibly in the tefillah of Boni Yerushalayim. Kimo b'Rosh Chodesh, she'omer yalav v'yavav Boni Yerushalayim. It goes into the bracha of Boni Yerushalayim, about building Yerushalayim. When we shum the yalav v'yavo he tefillah v'tachanunim, since that actually is prayer and supplication. Tiknua Boni Yerushalayim, the hinami tefillah. Uvishmanesrei tiknua ba'avoda. It goes in the bracha that yalav v'yavo goes in avoda. Shitfila hashiv Yisrael Yerushalayim. And I remind you again, the time of the holiday of Chanuka, beautiful time, but it wasn't a reflection of perfection per se. It was a moment of grandeur that absolutely has good reasons to celebrate it, but there were challenges, and there were reasons why one might have still been thinking, and we're hoping that things will still improve, having to do with the internecine battles within the Hasmonean dynasty, having to do with the reality that even though Greece was laid low, they still were an influence within the culture and the society, and that was still something that Klal Yisrael was grappling with. There's a sefer, it was written in the 18th century. It's called Shabbat Shalmi. The name escapes me now of the author. So he's an Achron, and he lived in Italy, in Ancona, Italy. I forgot his name. I'm sorry. He mentions here, he explains that HaNisim is in the past. Here we are. The Kevad HaNisim Hodahi Dishla'avar Lamatzin Lama'ailinhu Bebracha the Hitfila La'atid. It doesn't fit to put in a bracha that's about the future. It's all about the past, and therefore it should be in the past. And that which is for the future has its own bracha. That's the bracha of Uvanei Yerushalayim, Rachem Nashem Elokeinu, Bornei Berachamav Yerushalayim. That's the future. Rather, we put it has to do for the Shabbat Shalmi, for his perush. He thinks it's really related much more to the sense that we're thinking about yesteryear as opposed to projecting for the future. An interesting idea. Okay. Rav Soloveitchik tried to analyze this question about the placement of HaNisim in Birkat Hamazon. And he noted that when the Rambam wanted to codify HaNisim, he didn't put it into Hilchot Chanuka. Where did he codify it? The Rambam was extremely systematic. He codified and classified things in particular books. His was a Western, Yesh Omrim, Greek, Lo Aleinu, way of understanding the world in terms of his categorization and cataloging in his legal codex. What do I mean? As opposed to the Gemara, which is almost entirely associative, where topic wends its way to the next topic because we're listening in on a massive conversation. Instead of C-SPAN, it's much more interesting. It's all the Chachamim of hundreds of years having a dialogue over 2,711 pages of it in the Bavli, and then that's not including the Yerushalmi, et cetera, and all the Chachamim since. But the Rambam wrote a legal codex that was based on topic and subject matter, and every topic had subcategories. Every subcategory was divided into its own chapters and laws, and it would be much easier to find it. You'd think, well, of the 14 books in his Mishnah Torah, which one is this in? But that lends itself to a study, as Rav Soloveitchik learned in his family from the Brisker Derech, to understanding where the Rambam categorized something is also an indication of its meaning. HaNisim is not in Hilchot Chanuka. The Rambam put it instead in Hilchot Tefila. He referred to it in Hilchot Brachot. It sounds more like it's a din it's a halacha about the prayers, but it's not actually reflective of a theme of the day per se. It happens to be Chanukah. Here's how we modify the davening. But it's not making a statement about the day of Chanukah per se, the days of Chanukah per se. And indeed, the Rambam, he thinks that the word hoda'ah in the Gemara doesn't actually mean saying thanksgiving. He thinks the word hoda'ah, Hallel is what you say in shul. Hoda'ah for the Rambam is lighting Chanukah candles. It's an act of hoda'ah. And it's in your house, and it's Pirsumei Nisa to the street. That's how you fulfill it. He says this twice in Hilchot Chanukah. Now, the Tosfot that we just saw mentions that in the shul, you have Pirsumei Nisa. But at home, well, maybe not so much Pirsumei Nisa. Rav Soloveitchik said, according to Tosfot, What if a person was davening Shemona Esrei on their own, not in a shul? Would they say HaNisim? What's the Persumei Nisa? You're standing in your house with a sitter. It's COVID. So you're davening by yourself. So why should you say HaNisim? According to Tosfot's logic, that you're reciting it as a form of Persumei Nisa. Further, there's no Chazarat HaShatz for Mariv. Did anyone ever suggest that we don't say HaNisim at night? No, of course we do. So how could Tosfot be right? And the answer is, of course, the best we can do by way of an answer that the Rav gives is it was already established and enacted as being part of davening. So therefore, you're going to say it anyway, even though there'll be circumstances, if you're davening on your own, or if it's Mariv time and you're davening Mariv, where you're not really getting the Persumei Nisa. But the question about Birkat HaMazon still lingers because Birkat HaMazon is recited at home. Also, it's not necessarily recited out loud, and it's not going to be a presentation. It's everybody to themselves, just not to themselves, saying it to Hashem, but you're reciting it, yeah? So here's the question Rav Soloveitchik asked, sort of a thought problem. What if you were eating a meal on a Friday afternoon and the meal went into Shabbos? There are halachic problems with this, but let's take, for argument's sake, you continued a meal from Friday afternoon into the Leil Shabbos. You pause the meal, you make Kiddush, and you keep eating. Now it's time for Birkat HaMazon. Do you say the bracha of Ritzei? It's Shabbos now, but you started the meal before Shabbos started. Or conversely, it's Seudah Shlishit time. And at Seudah Shlishit, you started the meal, it was still Shabbos, but it went long. They sang a lot of Zmiris. There was a nice kumzitz at the end. Beautiful. Now it's an hour after Shabbos. You're going to say Ritzei? Everybody's driving their cars around outside. You're saying it's Shabbos? It's not Shabbos. It's Shabbos. You might still observe Shabbos. How can you still say Ritzei? This is actually a machloket haposkim, back and forth, the Shulchan Aruch and its Nosei Kelim. So the Rav presents this in the Sefer Harei Kedem, was posthumously put together based on notes from his Shiurim. The Rav says this thought problem is exactly the suffix of the Gemara that we just saw on page 24a, Chaf Daled Amud Aleph. The Tefila of Chanuka surely does warrant HaNisim in it. It's related to the day in some way, whether thematically or it's just baked into prayers, into Tefila. But what about a meal? There's no obligation to have a meal on Chanuka. And because there isn't an obligation, meaning Chachamim never said, you must eat X number of meals on Chanuka. There's no Sudat mitzvah on Chanuka. The Rama writes, if you have a meal, and it's a Sudat Reshut, he calls it, but you involve yourself with Divrei Torah, singing Shirot Tishbachot to Hashem, sing Zmirot, beautiful, so you elevated it. It's still not it's not the mitzvah of Chanukah is not to have a Suda, right? So if you choose to have a Suda, you establish a Suda, you're still not obligated to mention the day per se on account of having eaten that meal. In other words, it's not flowing from the obligation. On Shabbos, when you say Ritzei, it's because you had an obligation to eat a meal on Shabbos. So now the mention of Ritzei is intrinsic to the Birkat HaMazon. Or instead of seeing it that way, you might say like this: HaNisim on Chanukah might be a din in the day of Chanukah, regardless of whether you have a meal. It might be there's a halacha that the day of Chanukah means I have to give thanks. How do I give thanks? I say HaNisim. And therefore, it's irrespective of the fact there isn't actually a meal. So let me explain it as follows. This is why there's no question when it comes to Purim. On Purim, there's a mitzvah to eat a Suda. It's actually defined as Yom Mishta V'Simcha. That's what Chazal call it, a day of feasting and joy. So when you have your meal, Suda, on Purim, you're fulfilling a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, but you're fulfilling a mitzvah. Of course, you're going to say HaNisim. And by the by, if you're eating your meal on Purim and the sun sets and now it's dark outside, do you say HaNisim when it's Shush on Purim? Sure you do. Why? Because you started your meal before, but one other reason. You started your meal before and it was a din, it was a halacha that on that day you shall have a meal. Therefore, the eating of the meal that started on that day is extended to after it. But let's say the night of Purim, you decide you want to make a meal. You you come home from Megillah, you're famished. Let's make a Sudat Purim. You're allowed to do that. There's no kiyum of the mitzvah. Yet, one would recite HaNisim that night too. Why? Because it has the status of a Shem Sudat Purim. It's the night of Purim, but it's part of the holiday whose character is Yom Mishta V'Simcha. So here's what happens on Chanukah. And this is actually a halacha the Rav explained as follows. Let's say the last day of Chanukah, late in the afternoon, you decide to make a meal. You wash, you sit down, you're eating. Hey, you look at your watch, it's an hour after dark. So do you say HaNisim still or not? The answer is no, because the holiday's over. Ditto, by the way, for Rosh Chodesh, which is why sometimes back in the day when we did have, and God willing soon we'll have Seudah Shlishit again, we would come to this no man's land problem. It's Shabbos and it's Rosh Chodesh, both the same day. And we're sitting at Sudash Lishit, and the time is going. If we were to sit on Shabbos and Shabbos ended, now it's Saturday night. It's not Rosh Chodesh anymore, but it's still Shabbos for us because we didn't actually daven Mariv. What do we say in benching? We're stuck in a no man's land. On one level, we do say Ritzeh because it's still Shabbos for us. And we're extending our meal, our third meal of Shabbos, which is Sudash Lishit. But we don't say Yalav Yavo anymore. You know why? Because there was no Chiyuv Seuda on Rosh Chodesh. And Rosh Chodesh ended. Now, it's not the day anymore. Can't keep saying that Tefila. It's finished. It's gone bye-bye. But the problem is we're in a no man's land because on one level we're saying it is Shabbos, and the other level we're saying it's not Shabbos because Shabbos equals Rosh Chodesh on that particular configuration. So, to sum up, what the Rav explains is that Al HaNisim, although it's considered a bracha of thanksgiving, it is not considered Hazkarat Me'ein HaMa'ora, meaning it is not a recollection of events that are germane to why you're saying the tefillah, i.e. at the meal. You're mentioning it, even though there's no Kedushat Hayom. There is Kedushat Hayom on Shabbos and Yom Tov, but not on Chanuka. The chiyuv of adding in the bracha of Hoda'ah and Modim that we say is actually an obligation that stands on its own to give thanks to Hashem. It's not flowing from the idea that there's some special day that has Kedusha inherent in it that obligates us, in the case of Tefillah, or that obligates us in the case of a meal, that we need to make a meal happen. And particularly this comes up when we're talking about Birkat Hamazon. In davening, we mentioned Nisim, Al Nisecha Sheb'choim Yimanu. Good. Al Nisim Valapurka. And we're going to give an example of a nes that we're remembering right now. We're celebrating it. We give thanks to Hashem. Birkat Hamazon, we give thanks to Hashem for the food, for our covenants with God, for Torah, Eretz Yisrael, etc. But it's not about miracles per se. Al HaNisim, writes Rav Soloveitchik, is an additional obligation from the essence of the day to add thanksgiving to God in our Birkat Hamazon. How do we do it? We tell a story about a way in which we were actually physically saved. That's our thanksgiving. And the idea here is that our thanksgiving that we're reciting in our Birkat Hamazon is actually, even though it's the same words as what we say in the Tefillah, it's actually a bit of a different theme. In Tefillah, the emphasis is miracles. God, you do miracles for us all day, every day. Here's an example. Birkat Hamazon, even though it's the same syntax, the same words, imported straight through, we have a differentiation because there it's against the backdrop of we're thankful to you that we're alive. We're thankful to you that we have an ongoing relationship with you. So since these are days whose character is days of thanksgiving, here's how we will give the thanks. But we're not talking about events happening on the day itself. When you talk about Ritzeh, talk about Yalav Yavo, they go in the bracha of Boni Yerushalayim because each of them also has a petitional dimension that is connected to them. Let me pause here for a minute if people have questions or comments before I move to the next phase. Was this clear? Or somewhat clear? Okay, there's a lot more here. We're scratching the surface tonight, but just to get some ideas and try to understand the halachas of this a little bit more. Another theme, also from Rav Soloveitchik, but from a totally different sefer. This one written up by Rabbi Genax, it was Zayin Gezund from the OU, and the Shiur Harav. Rabbi Soloveitchik wanted to understand what does it mean when we say Ulecha asita al HaNisim, Ulecha asita Shem Gadol veKadosh beOlamecha. You made a name that is great and that is holy within your world. Now these words, I'm going to scroll up, don't get dizzy, but I want to show you where it is so you have the idea of where it comes from. It's right here in green, Ulecha asita Shem Gadol veKadosh beOlamecha, and it was borrowed, if you will, from the words that came before, Modim D'Rabbanan, L'shimcha Gadol v'Akadosh. The difference is here, your name that is great and that is holy, and here it's you made for yourself a name that is great and is holy in your world. This perhaps is a statement about God's nature. Your name, God, is great, your name is holy. We'll understand these terms in a minute. But in this case, here's where it was made manifest, and that's what I'm saying in my Al HaNisim. In your world, God, you made this apparent to us thanks to the holiday of Chanuka. Let's move on. Back to this section. Rav Soloveitchik explains that when we are saying the Birkat Hamazon in any bracha, it's not just that we're thanking God for the food. The main issue is that we are trying to awaken within ourselves an awareness, a recognition. I'm pointing to the word. Yitorer banu hakarat adnuto, God's mastery, umalchuto, his dominion, al kol barav, upon all his creations. Vayedei zeh, through this, yitgadal v'yitkadash shemo hagadol. Do you see the two words here? Shem gadol v'kadosh. This is yitgadal v'yitkadash. Yitgadal v'yitkadash means magnified and sanctified will God's name be. This is, you made the gadol and the kadosh manifest. We saw Kaddish come alive in our day, the days of Chanuka. Now, he explains, this is actually at the core of the words that we have. This is kind of jargon here. I'll show you too inside the verses themselves of why we have Birkat HaMazon. Birkat HaMazon is to eat, to be satiated, to bless God for the land, the good land that he gave us. And the next words are already cautionary. Be careful, because being in a moment of satiation is also the moment of potential pitfall where an individual will forget HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What will they conclude instead? They'll say, a lot of verbiage, but bottom line, you'll say in your heart, my strength, my prowess brought me to this bounty. Rather, remember God. For the Nes Pach Shemen, may I ask, does anybody think the Nes Pach Shemen was a fluke? After day one, it said, wow, that's amazing. Day two, day three, every day more, it's saying this is a nes. But the war was about really smart people. People with sunglasses perched on their head, with their arms on their hips, looking out probably through some binoculars, figuring out where the chayalim are going to go. To wit, et hachayil hazeh. Chayil here means bounty, actually, but I'm borrowing the term. And that's where you need an HaNisim. That's where we need a hakara, a recognition. Hashem is actually all from you. Ulecha asita Hashem gadol v'kadosh b'olamecha. We need a prayer to thank Hashem for that lakat neirot. For that, we light candles for the nes Pach Shemen. But for the nes of the war, that needs recognition. That needs an awareness that actually all of it, though it seems so natural, so obvious that the half tracks and the Merkavas were able to get where they needed to go, and the Tzanchanim landed exactly the right spot. And Baruch Hashem, they beat back the greatest superpower the world had ever known to that point, Alexander of Macedon, having conquered most of the known world before he was 33 years of age. They were able to take them down with very little training. Amazing. Jewish ingenuity, the startup nation. Ulecha asit Hashem gadol v'kadosh b'olamecha is intrinsic to our being part of the story of the world, is recognizing a Kadosh Baruch Hu's role in it. That's the point of a bracha, any bracha. It's to magnify, to sanctify his great name. And indeed, that's what any matter of sanctity means. As we say in Kaddish, same thing. The Torah writes, Yitgadal v'yikdash, husad al pia mikra, it's based on a pasuk, v'yitgadalti v'yitgadashti, ha'omer v'mlechemet gog u'magog, is actually two words, I will be magnified and sanctified, with regard to the great war at the end of time. It's about a war. Sha'az yitgadel shmo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What's the miniaturized version of that great war? All the wars that come before. That war, when I say great war, I don't mean great that it's amazing. I mean great that it is so vast and so universal in terms of its impact that the net result is the arrival of Mashiach Tzidkenu, right? Same thing with Kedusha. I remember Besof Birkat Ata Kadosh. What do we say after we finish Kedusha? V'shivchacha Elokeinu epinu le'yamush kikel melech gadol v'kadosh Ata. We put these two words together all the time. So do we say in HaNisim. V'luchas Hashem gadol v'kadosh b'olamecha. Also modim derabanan. Brachot v'doshim cha gadol v'kadosh. And so it is in Yishtabach every day. Yishtabach Shem Chalam Elokeinu hakel hamelech hagadol v'hakadosh b'shamayim v'aretz. Every day in Shmona Esrei, in Yishtabach, in HaNisim, in Kedusha, we're using this expression, Gadol and Kadosh. What's the nature of the word Gadol? The nature of the word Gadol is God's greatness, obvious, but the greatness usually refers to the chesed that Hashem does, the relationship HaKadosh Baruch Hu has with us. Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, L'chashem hagedula ve'hagevura v'tiferet v'netzach, 7 attributes by which God interacts with the world. The word gedula is always a stand-in for Hashem's chesed. What's kadosh? Hashem, kedusha with Hashem means He's beyond. He's outside of our understanding. He's outside and transcendent and separate. The word kadosh actually means something separated from something else. The notion of a Kadosh Baruch Hu's transcendence. And that balance, your Gadol and your Kadosh, both of these elements are I wouldn't say they're in a tension almost that's being balanced out constantly. And we're always the ones declaring that you're Gadol and you're Kadosh. That's what the words mean that we say all the time. That's why we keep coming back to them again and again. I'll show you some other examples of this. But first, I want to turn up the microscope one notch farther to look at one single word, the word hoda'ah. Does anyone have questions at this point, or can I go to the next phase? Yeah? Good? Okay. I don't think I put everyone to sleep because I can see most faces and it seemed like people are still awake. So that's good. Let's move on. The Pachad Yitzchak Rav Hutner writes, with regard to Chanuka, it's part of a larger essay. He points out that at the end of HaNisim, you have this line that tells you, I put it here in purple, that tells you, and they enacted 8 days rather of Chanuka, these 8 days, in order to give thanks and to praise to your great name, Shimcha Gadol. Yeah, okay. Why not HaKadosh, by the way? Shimcha Gadol, because God's presence is palpable, because they're involved with him. Yeah, Shim Gadol v'Kadosh b'Olamecha. So God's presence is palpable. This is not Rav Hutner. This is Tzvi Engel speaking now, right? What does it mean? Why isn't the Kadosh part there? Where's the Kadosh part? The Kadosh part was everywhere. It's when they went back into the Makom HaMikdash. That was the whole point of it. But the days themselves about God's great name, because they felt God's greatness, they saw what had happened, how they had won the war. Rav Hutner writes that he has an expression he likes to use, some amazing turns of phrase. He says that in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, 2 words came to the same inn. Nizdamnu lepundak echad, like 2 visitors in the same inn, but it means that there's something connecting the 2 of them. The word hoda'ah means 2 things. One is dankin, hava'at zakat tova, you're saying thank you to someone. The other one is that a person is saying, I accept what you say, nechgeben. So these 2 concepts have the same word, hoda'ah. In a court of law, a hodat baldin means the confession or the acceptance by one of the parties. It's an acceptance of what the other party has said. Hoda'at baldin, that's what it means. Hoda'ah is, on the past, means I'm giving thanks of something that happened in the past. I'm giving hoda'ah of something in the past means not I'm confessing about it. It actually means I'm saying thank you. And these two concepts are actually bound up with the same word. We're a little short on time, so just tell you, he explains it as follows. He basically says, when a person has a sense of thanksgiving, the thanksgiving to the other also means a recognition that the other has done something for them. And they accept, therefore, not only the favor that they've received or the goodness that they've received, but also the notion that they accept that the other is real and impactful upon them. And at the exact moment that a person is saying thank you, they're also coming to that hakara, that recognition. These 2 things at the same time. And he says, it's the same thing. It's all the more so between us and Hashem. All the more so that it's that way. As we're saying thank you, it's a greater and greater magnification, if you will, of our recognition of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is involved in our lives and has given us this goodness. The Chidushe Harim, the Ger Rebbe, writes this in a bit of a different way, but it's along the same lines. The Yomim Tov B'Hal V'Hodah, God called light day. Shekara Hashem Le'or Yom. The Katav B'Zohar Kadosh Emor, Parshat Emor, Shenikra Yom Tov. Why do we call Yom Tov a Yom Tov? Why is it called a Yom Tov, a good day? Shemeir Mituv Shegana, Mitov, Shegana as HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Olam Haba. There is goodness that God has hidden away for the next world. But whenever we have a Yom Tov, it's like God's opening the storehouse and we're getting a little bit of a glimpse, a little bit of a glimmer. Something is coming out at us, a ray of light from that great storehouse that's been hidden away. Uvenes de Chanuka, Kavu Chazal V'Asum Yamim Tovim. It said so in the Gemara, back on the first page. Days that are good days. What does it mean, good days? They're not Yom Tov like Sukkot, not like Pesach, not like Shavuot, but they're good days. Why? B'Hal V'Hodah. Sheyair or haganuz benekuda hapnimit sheba b'nei Yisrael b'chol shana b'shana otan hayamim, that there should be some of the hidden light that is the little pintala, the little point that's within every Jew in the neshama should be awakened in these days of Hallel and the Hallel Hodot, to give praise and thanksgiving. Shal Shem Zen Nikreu Yehudim. Al Shem Yehuda. That's why we're called Yehudim. I would mention also that it's only in the Second Temple period that we're called Yehudim, based on Medinat Yehud that we had there. There was Malchut Yehuda before, but there were still Jews from this tribe and that tribe. But after the exile, we come back, we're all just Yehudim. You could say we're all thankful to be alive. But this is what he's basically writing. Hapam Odeh, as Leah Imenu said when Yehuda was born, this time I will give thanks. That's why she called him Yehuda. What did Rashi write? Shinatalti yoter al chelki. I took more than my allotment. V'nachnu b'nei Yisrael, kol ma she'Hashem yitbarach notein, anu yodim. Everything God gives us, we know. She's a yoter mimash ru'uyim. It's really more than we're worthy of receiving. וזה המעט מכל העמים, כל כך במדרש, שכשנותן להם גדולה ממעיטים עצמם, יותר, שיודעים שזה בחסד של ברוך ונקראים יהודים. The idea that when the Torah says we are the smallest of all the nations, the Medrash says doesn't mean we're literally the smallest. It means whenever we get greatness heaped upon us, gedula, not great, excuse me, it means the bestowal of goodness and good fortune and chesed, we self-deprecate. We realize we're not really even worthy of this, and therefore we're called Yehudim. This Chidush Harim is the Hasidic way of saying what Rav Hutner is writing over here, that the word Hoda'ah is at once thank you, and a recognition in the word thank you is I recognize your role as regards me. And the two are oscillating a certain way from one to the other between them, if you will, right? And the idea here to think about this is perhaps along the lines of what we see in the Tefila itself. If you line up the two HaNisims, you'll see the following. The one for Chanuka and the one for Purim are identical. It's a story and it's a rescue. The difference is that when it comes to Chanuka, we want to know about the impact and the aftermath and establishing a Yom Tov. And the question is, why didn't anyone write anything here? It's like it's so short. So for Purim, we could say already, we thought it was just Hipil Pur Hua Goral is someone's drawing lots, and it's our fate, and the fates, Lo Aleinu, just worked out. It was luck of the draw. No, so the story tells us, you did this, God. You did this. You caused all these things to happen, even though we're human agents, but you did it, Hashem. And that's what we're saying here too. We thought the rescue was just the smart, brilliant strategists who were well trained and well schooled and had good luck and everything. No, nothing like that. It was actually from Hashem. But when we talk about the long-term impact of what happened at the end of the Purim story, everybody goes back to being subject to Achashverosh and paying taxes. But in the case of Chanuka, God's name was magnified and sanctified, not just in the sense of the moment, but actually moving forward. Here, Bnei Yisrael, now called Yehudim, understood their place in Eretz Yisrael, but also as Jews in a broader societal context where the regnant culture was not just pagan that they could throw away very easily with a wave of the hand. Idolatry seemed foolish at that point, but rather a culture that was smart and actually had competing ideas of philosophy and of architecture and mathematics and the arts, be they in terms of performing arts or in other kinds of physical expressions, or the world of sports, or economics, or politics, or the list goes on and on and on. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'chasi d'Hashem Gadol v'Kadosh B'Olamech. And what was our role after we referred to Hashem? You made a name that was great and was holy in your world, and you saved us. You gave us this chua. What did we do with it? Here's what your children did. We realized we still have a relationship with you ongoing. And therefore we came to your sanctuary and we cleaned it out and we purified it and we lit the candles. And then we established the holiday that is all about this Hoda'ah, which is not just the Hoda'ah for winning the war, but it turns out is also the Hoda'ah that we could continue to exist against a worldview that remains exceedingly challenging for so many of our confreres. I say each year in the name of Rav Hutner from another essay, there were no mitmatzrim, there were no mitbavlim, there were no mitparsim, there were only mityavnim. first time there was an ideology that Jews held up a banner and said, "We'd like to be just like them, and we'll make into a cause, a campaign." And the Sefer Bate Kahuna, I'll skip the biography, but he basically writes that when we read the Megillah on Purim, so that's the Pirsumei Nisa at night. And at night we have concomitant to that, the lighting of the Chanukah candles. During the day on Purim, we read the Megillah. During the day, we don't have a Megillah for Chanukah. Instead, what do? We say Hallel. We say Hoda'ah. We don't have the Nes Pach Shemen during the day. At night, we're reflecting on the miracle of the oil. And by day, we're reflecting about the war. I don't know if it's entirely correct. I don't know. At night, you're also saying Al HaNisim. It's also about the war. But he seems to want to argue that unlike Purim, where there's a book for the night and the same book for the day, and it's amplifying the one theme of salvation, on Purim, on Hanukkah rather, it's Hallel and Hoda'ah that's taking place, one at night and one during the day. Okay, maybe yes, maybe not. Excuse me, during the day is the Hallel part in the recitation of Hallel. And he gives examples. Last source that we have time for, and I have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to make the most of it. There's 2 sources left, but the last one's just a 1 sentence. The Bnei Yissaschar loved Hanukkah, and he tries to explain the idea that when we're saying the words of Hoda'ah, why is Al HaNisim so vital for us, not just in the moment, but for the future? He said, I'll also tell you why they were Matake and Hoda'ah Daika, why that's the theme. If someone is willing to say thank you to God for a miracle they got, that happened to them, they'll be saved from the next one. Zichrono Livracha, Chayol Maba, etc. This is what the Chida wrote, an earlier source, and he explains a basic idea. I'm skipping the verbiage. Ubezeh pirashnu Birkat Hodah b'shmona esrei. Modem anachnu lach al nisach laniflotach al kulam yitbarach v'chol achayim. Everything that we say. Al kain. Therefore, these words at the end, Hakel Yeshua Tenu Sala, means that which is going to happen in the future. You'll save us in the future. Help us in the future. It's Lomar. Since we are saying thank you now, you will always be our help. We're, in other words, taking from our Al HaNisim, or rather from our Bracha Modim, we're taking strength for the next go around. Now you can understand, he says, Mashatiknu b'Chanuka sof HaNisim Hoda Daika. It was the last of all the miracles, the last miracle that we have a holiday for. He didn't know about Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim yet, but okay. But they were saved from Galut of Yavan, and they understood that they had come closer to the end of Galut. They were coming closer to the end of Galut, but also they knew that there's still one more exile coming, the long night of exile of Rome. And therefore we need the salvation of Hashem every single day. And therefore we're taking from this holiday, every day that is established, every day that we're saying we're giving thanks, we're also taking strength every time we say thank you for the next go around, the next line. The next time we'll have to deal with the same issues. We're saying we're going to take from it. And he's saying basically that the Al HaNisim of Chanuka, that's why it was so absolutely significant, because from Rome there was not yet a great miracle. He writes, I would argue there was something. We would, I think, all agree, I hope on this call, would most of us agree, something amazing is underway in the manner of a Chanuka, but also with all the pitfalls of a Chanuka, which makes an Al HaNisim all the more significant. On these days of Chanuka, we'll say a Shir Shel Yom every day after our regular Shir Shom at the end of our prayers in the morning. It was so significant, this Shir Shel Yom, that at some point in the Middle Ages, people started reciting at the beginning of davening, not just Chanuka, but every single day. It was the Mizmor Shir Chanuka Habayit LeDavid, for obvious reasons, about coming back, dedicating the Chanuka of Chanuka Habayit LeDavid, that he came back, he started inaugurating, dedicating the house in Yerushalayim. And how does it end? So that my soul will make music to you and will not be silent. Hashem, my God, forever will I give you thanks. And I think that's a fitting coda for this evening and for Chanukah in general. This was the song of the day, as it were, as they say, of the house of Chashmonai, of the Hasmonean dynasty. And thanks to their victory on Purim, on Chanukah, I keep saying Purim, on Chanukah, where they were thanking Hashem for bringing them the Nes of Hatzalah and the sign of the Nes Pach Shemen, that all that had come before was, of course, also the Yad Hashem. So wish everyone a Chanukah Sameach, a lichtigin Chanukah, a light-filled Chanukah, and we should be zochim to recite the HaNisim, hopefully, with a little more insight into the mechanics of it, but also to its basic themes in connection not only to the Tefila, but also in our moments of thanksgiving. And we should be zochim to same as well. Chanukah Sameach, everybody. And good Erev Shabbos.